So Isaiah was a pre-exilic prophet. Isaiah experienced the prophetic ministry prior to the Assyrian exile. Okay, prior to the Assyrian exile. Now, what's difficult about that is that chapters 40 through 65 or 66, the end of the book, is about the return from what? Which exile? Babylonian exile. So he's actually writing before the Assyrian exile, yet he gives writings about the return from the Babylonian exile. And he gives judgment against Babylon as well, I believe in Isaiah 13. So that's where it becomes difficult. I had a teacher in college who helped me understand it like this. This is just one of those pictures that will just stick with you. It's kind of like this. Imagine there's a father. Okay, there's a father. His wife is pregnant with their first child. And before the child is born, he's diagnosed with cancer. And he's only going to live another 2, maybe 3 years. He'll see the child born. He'll see the child maybe take his first steps or her first steps. But he will not see her date, marry, reach adulthood. So what he does is, it's so emotional, it's so funny, but this really gets at it. He writes letters to her for her birthday every year, for, say, her first 30 years of life. And he gives her, the mom, the envelopes, and says, give her one of these every year, right? So he writes a letter for her before she's born for, like, her 30th birthday, right? He knows what kind of struggle she's going to have when she's 11 and 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 and so on. And he wants to give her fatherly advice, like, for those times. I think it's helpful to think of Isaiah like that. So liberal scholars, on the other hand, would tend to say this. There's probably more than one Isaiah. There's 2, maybe even 3 Isaiahs. So one of them is writing at the time of the Assyrian, before the Assyrian exile. And then other Isaiahs are coming around. People in the name of Isaiah are coming around and writing about the return from Babylon, because, of course, this couldn't be predicted. Furthermore, Isaiah names Cyrus, king of Persia, before the Assyrian exile. Whew. Wow. He names Cyrus for the Medes and the Persians, right? The leader of the Medo-Persian Empire, by name. Which, if you believe in predictive prophecy, you have no problem with any of this whatsoever. But chapters 1 through 39 describe Israel's present sin and the judgment against the nations. And then chapters 40 through 66 describe Israel returning from Babylon. Okay. And then hidden without that, though, hidden within all of this is different sections about the future return from exile and the future glory of Jerusalem. So let's start with Isaiah 2, 1 through 4. Read this with the person next to you. Isaiah 2, 1 through 4. Try to understand what's Isaiah saying here. What's Isaiah saying, and when does this happen? Okay, so Isaiah gives a time indication of when it happens, right? Isaiah tells us when this will happen. When will it happen? In the latter days. It will happen in the latter days. Where have we seen the latter days so far? 2 other places we've looked at in particular. Genesis 49, yeah. Judah will be exalted in the latter days. And then there was one other text that we looked at that mentioned the latter days. Numbers, do you remember the Balaam oracles? What chapter? 24, yeah, Numbers 24. Both of those were telling of events that would happen in the latter days. And who were they about? Jesus. It's at least interesting, right? You think it might describe after the consummation as well as the present church age? Okay. So who says this is describing the eternal state? Raise your hand.
What do you mean by eternal state?
Like after the final coming of Christ. This is describing events that occur after the final coming of Christ. Yeah, just say just that. These are events that occur after. Just that, yeah. Okay. How many of you say these are describing events of today?
Just that?
Sure. Raise your hand for anything you agree with. Yeah. I think these are happening today. Raise your hand.
Yes, but
Okay. If you think these are happening in a future millennium, raise your hand. The millennium is like the mop closet. Okay, or like the storage closet of like eschatology for premillennialists, right? So what I mean by that is that they find something and they're like, I don't know what this thing is. Let's just throw it in the mop closet. Let's just throw that, and that goes in the millennium. I don't know when this is. I'll just put that in the millennium. When I don't see anything in the text, I don't see anything in this text. Do you see anything in the text that describes a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth? Yeah, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, do you see anything in the text that describes this is happening during a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth? Because you said it was during the millennium. Or are you saying it has to be in the millennium because it can't be now? Okay, and that's what I just said. It can't be now. This can't be now. I've decided that already, so throw that in the mop closet. Right? The millennium just kind of becomes this place where we throw everything we don't know or don't know what to do with it. Or that can't be now. I've categorically decided it can't be now, therefore throw it in the mop closet. I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but I am saying that's what premillennialists do. If I'm misrepresenting you, please let me know. Go ahead. The millennium. Okay. So here's what we cannot do. Okay. Here's what we cannot do. I think we can't make the millennium the tail that wags the dog. We can't make the millennium the tail that wags the dog. It's the little chapter at the end. That's one of the most unclear texts in all of Scripture. It's one of the most debated texts in all of Scripture. Yet that is the controlling text for everything. I think that's a bad hermeneutical choice. Let me give you a few ideas about this. First of all, when do the latter days begin? Yeah. Have the latter days already begun? Yes. Let's look at a few ideas about the future of Jerusalem. One, I think we are looking back to Genesis 49:1 in a few different ways. First, the reference to the latter days, but also the reference to the obedience of the peoples. Right? I think the obedience of the peoples is mentioned here in similar ways to Genesis 49:10. That he may teach us in the ways we should walk in his paths, and many nations, all peoples shall come to him. Psalm 69, 86 as well. All nations will come and worship before you. So here's just a quick description of what's being said here. The temple will be exalted above all other temples, showing that God will be victorious over all false gods. That's what happens here. More specifically, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be the tallest mountain. All nations and many peoples will come to the mountain of the Lord in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. These people flow up the mountain. Do you see it? They flow up the mountain. It's water imagery. Water doesn't flow up mountains. So it indicates God sovereignly drawing these people to himself, I think. They worship the true God. The worship of the true God will result in the end of warfare. Instead, the nations will look to God and his law to settle disputes. So here's this is just a description of what's said in the text, right? I do think this is a description of what happens between the two advents of Christ. I do think it's a description of what happens between the two advents of Christ. And here I think I answer your practical question after I finish explaining why. One, the mountain of the Lord is fulfilled in Zion, which we've already seen is the Jerusalem above, our mother. Hebrews 11:16, we have come to Mount Zion, the holy Jerusalem. Hebrews 11:16, he was looking for another country. Without us, he's incomplete. Hebrews 12:22, we've come to Mount Zion. It's established, is what it says. I think we can see that in texts like Matthew 16:18. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Hebrews 12:28, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. The kingdom that we've received cannot go away. The temple of the Lord is fulfilled in the church, I think. 1 Corinthians 3:17, you are the temple. Ephesians 2:21, we are that temple. The church comes to worship Christ as king, and she sings the song of Moses also. Remember we saw Psalm 86? Psalm 86 is quoted in Revelation 15. Who will not glorify your name? For you alone are holy, so that all nations will come and worship before you. Okay. Which, no matter what your view of Revelation 20 is, Revelation 15 is not the same chapter as Revelation 20, right? I mean, everyone can agree with what I just said there. Revelation 15 and 20 are different chapters, right? What your conclusion from that is, I don't know. But they're not the same chapter. So I think that this is a poetic description of the church being exalted, all nations coming and experiencing the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. And verse 4 actually is one of the main reasons why. There is a beating of swords into plowshares. They're not learning war anymore. They're learning peace. And there's disputes. There's disputes that are still happening. I don't see how this could describe an eternal state in which all warfare has ended. This seems to say that there's nations that are coming and learning to not do war as they experience the benefits of the gospel. So why are there wars still today? Because Isaiah 44 that we already saw, or 42, he will not rest until he establishes justice in the earth. It's being fulfilled, but it's not there yet. The nations are still flowing. The nations are still beating. And the day will come when they will not learn war anymore, but we're not there yet. We're getting there progressively. Yeah. Well, I think the picture there is like what are they changing their weapons into? Farming tools, yeah. They're changing their weapons into farming tools. They're showing dominion like Adam was supposed to. I think that's the picture. But why do we not? So the question is, why do we not see it? I think in some senses we do, and I think when the gospel takes full effect and full roots in people's hearts, the result is that disputes are settled by Christ and His law. That's what the text says, and not by killing each other. So your question is, how far can we go with this verse? As far as the text lets us go. Right. Now what we have to keep at the center is the gospel. Right? This doesn't happen because we're forcing people to do it. This is not describing a political reality. This is describing it's not a socio-political kingdom. The kingdom of Christ is not a socio-political kingdom. That's what the Jews thought, right? They were trying to seize him force him to make him king. He's like, no. The kingdom doesn't come like that. The kingdom comes in a spiritual, redemptive way as hearts are converted through the gospel, right? The kingdom does not come through politics. The kingdom does not come through war. The kingdom does not come through destruction. The kingdom comes through the faithful preaching of the gospel. Yeah, and we'll see that when Christ inaugurates the kingdom. The promised child, Isaiah 9, 6 through 7. He's going to do two things. Turn there with me. He does two verbs. He establishes the Davidic covenant, and he upholds the Davidic covenant when he comes. Okay? He establishes it, and he upholds it. Now, how does he do it? How does he uphold it? First of all, you see you can kind of see the two commands to Adam, to work and to keep here, maybe. He establishes it and he upholds it. But then how does he establish it? How does he uphold it? Through the increase of his government and the increase of his peace. Now, if there's increase of his government and if there's increase of his peace, then the kingdom must be a progressively expanding kingdom in fulfillment of Genesis 1:28, as Christ subdues the earth. This is not a picture of a kingdom that comes in like the 42nd Airborne and just everyone's wiped out. It's not a picture of a kingdom that just nuclear bomb explosion, everything's done. This is a picture of a kingdom that grows gradually as his government increases and his peace increases. So where do we see that in the New Testament? Well, Jesus is the promised child, right? He's the child born of a virgin, Isaiah 7:14. And Jesus is the exalted king. Acts 2:34. And Jesus is expanding his kingdom until the last enemy to be destroyed is death. His government and peace are being established in the earth. It's Adam language, I think. Adam was meant to be the righteous judge at the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He failed to do that. This king will exercise justice. He'll exercise justice rightly. It's the same thing we saw in Isaiah 2, that, where is it? Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and we may walk in his paths. The nations say, we want to know the law of God. We want to live in right relationship with God. We want to be taught from the king who exercises justice. That's the picture. So then here, he establishes and upholds the kingdom in justice and righteousness. And his kingdom is increasing, and his peace is increasing, and there'll be no end to it. But look at how this is used in Matthew. You know, this is quoted in Matthew. Where is it? Matthew 4. Now when they heard, verse 12. Now when they heard that John had been arrested and withdrew into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he went into Capernaum by the sea, to the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. So that was what was spoken by Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, but the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. And do you see how what he does? The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those dwelling in the region and the shadow of death, on them the light has dawned. I think the picture here is the return from exile, I think, in the Isaiah story originally. And when Jesus comes, he preaches the gospel of the return from exile. And anyone who comes into his kingdom is no longer walking in darkness. They've now seen a great light. So I don't think that this is a Jewish kingdom here. I think this is the kingdom of David, which includes Jews and Gentiles. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my people would fight for it. When the kingdom comes, the Jews expected it to be a political kingdom, but it wasn't. That's what Jesus corrected them in. The kingdom is not a political kingdom. It's a redemptive spiritual kingdom in which the hearts of men are converted and Jesus rules over them. I don't think that we can override what Jesus says when he says that my kingdom is not of this world. When Jesus makes claims of the kingdom being spiritual, and we'll see this when we get to the Gospels. Of course, it's already not yet, but already not yet doesn't mean it's spiritual now and it's going to be political later. I don't think that I agree with already not yet, but I don't agree with the assumption you're making about the not yet. I think you're making an assumption about it that Jesus specifically denies. Well, you're importing, so he says, my kingdom is not of this world. You're importing the word first into there. My first kingdom is not of this world, but my second kingdom will be. But he doesn't say that. I think the entire picture of the kingdom is that it started at the time of Jesus and then it grows. And we'll see this more when we get to the Gospels. But it doesn't grow into something that the seed wasn't. Or it doesn't grow into something spiritually and then, boom, gone, and now we have the political. But already not yet means that what exists in seed grows into fullness. There's no discontinuity. Okay, next, the nations are blessed in the eschatological King David. Let's look at Isaiah 11, 9 through 12. They shall not hurt or destroy in my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. In that day the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnants that remain for his people, from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and the coastlands of the sea. And he will raise a signal for the nations and assemble the banished of Israel and gather the depressed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So I think what we see here is, one, the enemies of Israel become worshipers of God. The enemies of Israel become worshipers of God in verse 11. Now what's especially interesting is Assyria, right? Because of the context of Isaiah. Assyria is the main enemy of the people of God there. Assyria will be converted, is the picture. The exiles return to the promised land in verse 11 also. He's gathering them a second time. It's second Exodus. But it's not just Jerusalem, but look at verse 9. It's all of the earth that's called the holy mountain. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water cover the sea. The whole earth is filled with the knowledge of the glory of God. Now, certainly in some ways this happened when Israel returned from exile, but not in the full glory sense, right? God gathered his people again, as he said he would in Deuteronomy 30. However, there seems to be more that needs to be fulfilled here. So dispensationalists will read this text and they'll say, well, this is describing a day in which Israelites from around the world are gathered in and brought to the land of Israel, and they live there in a future millennial kingdom. Yeah, 1948 they would say is a significant event there, right? And God is going to gather the Gentiles again. The problem is, and they get it from verse 11, he will recover his people from the remnants of, and he lists the nations. The problem there, though, is that I think verse 12 seems to indicate that it's not Israelites from the whole earth, but instead it's the nations that are coming to worship. In verse 9, the earth will be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Also, it's bookended here with these promises of the nations coming to know God, I think. The coastlands, once again, we see. Where do we see coastlands already? Isaiah 2, the coastlands wait for his law. So I think, and his resting place. His resting place in verse 10. His resting place will be glorious. Now this is a reference to the temple. The resting place of God is the temple. So the resting place of God in Genesis 2 was where God rested in his cosmic temple after creating the world. But Psalm 132 also calls the temple, or the Ark of the Covenant in particular, the resting place of God. Right? So either this is describing some kind of end times temple that's rebuilt, that is glorious, right? He will dwell in an end times temple that is glorious, or it's describing the church. I think it's probably describing the church. His resting place will be glorious as describing the church. Again, to go back to a physical temple where people would have to go to experience nearness to God is a regression in redemptive history. So I think read in light of the New Testament, this is a description of the church in which the nations come and find their home as God gathers his elect from all around the world, and God's resting place is glorious, and that's a description of the temple. I think it's just simply saying he's gathering Jews and Gentiles from around the world to create this new resting place of God that will be glorious. It's his people, his people that are Jews and Gentiles. His people that are Jews and Gentiles, I think. Yeah, I think in the historic context, it's an exile to Assyria. However, the nations described here are bigger than the Assyrian kingdom. So he's clearly looking beyond that initial fulfillment for something more. And so I think what he's probably referring to is, in a New Testament context, the elect exiles, right? To use 1 Peter language, who are being called. Okay, I want you to read Isaiah 65, and I want you to start at the beginning and go all the way through verse 25 and ask, when is this fulfilled? Or ask this, what is this describing? What is this describing? Isaiah 65, 1 through 25. Maybe. So let's understand the context. One, the context of the Noah story. Now, this is outside of what you read, but Isaiah 54. Okay, can someone read Isaiah 54, 9 through 10 on the board? So what's the picture from the Noah story? A judgment, but the people are preserved, right? He's not going to do what he told Noah he wouldn't do. The people are preserved. Isaiah 40, verse 4, every mountain and hill will be made low, every valley will be exalted. So again, we're talking in both of these texts, we're talking about some kind of cosmic upheaval language, right? Now, we already saw Isaiah 11. The wolf will lay down with the lamb. The lion shall eat straw with the ox. They shall not hurt or harm in my holy mountain. So he's quoting Isaiah 11. And what happens in that day is the second Exodus, right? This is the day the second Exodus comes. Okay, so new creation. So first there's the new creation in the Noah story. Now there's new creation in the Exodus story, okay? Context 3, I think, is the exile to Babylon and the judgment of Babylon. Okay? So Babylon was destroyed, and the destruction of Babylon, as described in Isaiah 13, is stars falling from heaven. The constellations not giving their light. The sun will be dark at its rising. The moon will not shed light. Therefore, I make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place. Okay? The picture is cosmic destruction. The picture is cosmic destruction that happens as Babylon falls. So I think Isaiah uses new creation language to describe Israel's return from exile. Isaiah uses new creation language to describe Israel's return from exile. The old world has been destroyed. The Babylon world has been destroyed. It's now time for the new world, the new creation world, to begin. Of course, this is fulfilled ultimately and finally, but I think the type, the picture comes from the return from the Babylonian exile. So I think we see this in Isaiah 14. Can someone read the verses on the board? Okay, so that's describing return from exile, right? We all agree with that. I mean, I don't think anyone can disagree. Verses 1 through 3 are about to return to exile. And then he describes it later poetically. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypress rejoices at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter has come upon us. The trees are singing. It's all at rest because Babylon has been laid low. Right? This is just poetic imagery describing the destruction of the old creation, which is Babylon, and the establishment of the new creation, which is Israel in her land. Isaiah 55 described it the same way. So this is the word, comfort my people, going out and being effective. And this is what happens when the word comfort, what is comfort my people about? It's about the return from exile in Isaiah 40. And as that word goes out, and as we're on the high mountain saying, behold your God, as Israel in their time, as they're describing the return from exile, this is what it says. You will go out in joy and be led forth in peace, and the mountains and the hills will break before you into singing. Thank you, Mikey. And the trees of the field will clap their hands. And instead of the thorn shall come up with the cypress, and instead of the briar shall come with the myrtle. And it shall be made a name for the Lord, an everlasting sign that will not be cut off. Isaiah 60 also uses the same language. Arise, shine, for your light has come. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. All nations shall come to your light, and the kings brightness of your rising. Again, I think it's describing the return from exile, the day of judgment. Isaiah 61 through 3 is depicting the coming restoration and redemption of Israel against the background of Genesis 1, 2 through 4. The reason for doing this is that Isaiah understands the future blessing of Israel and the world to be recapitulation of the first creation, so that Israel and the nation's salvation is painted as new creation and emerges from spiritual darkness. The same notion of new creation, light, presumably is also in the mind of New Testament allusions to that Isaiah verse. Okay. So the immediate context, though. The immediate context in verse 16 is the one who blesses himself in the land and the one who takes an oath in the land. It's talking about the return from exile, and then immediately it says, for behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth. But then, it's not just creating the new heavens and new earth. Look what else he's creating. There's 3 times he says create. What are the 3 times he says create in verses 17 and 18? What does he create? Good. He creates a new heavens and new earth. And Jerusalem. Before that, he says, "Be glad in what I will be glad in what I create," right? But the picture is the new creation, which is the new Jerusalem city, right? The new creation is a poetic description of the creation of the new Jerusalem, which is the exact same thing we see in Revelation 21, isn't it? Look with me at Revelation 21. I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And the new city is the new creation, is the mountain, is the bride in Revelation 21. And Isaiah is using the exact same image, I think. It's a return from exile. The new creation language, I think, is connected to the Davidic kingdom also. So that's why he uses the same language as Isaiah 11. Isaiah 11, you're talking about the shoot from the stump of Jesse, which of course is fulfilled in Christ. The wolf shall lie down with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and fattened calf together, the child shall lead them. Is a direct connection with Isaiah 65:25. The wolf and the lamb shall graze together. And we already pointed this out, but I think it can't be a description of the eternal state, and the eternal state only. Okay? The new creation that John sees goes beyond this. It goes beyond what Isaiah sees. I think Isaiah is excited about the return of Israel from Babylonian exile after the Babylonian world has been decreated and the new Jerusalem world is recreated. But John looks beyond that to a time when there's no death. Death will be no more. It's better than Isaiah. The serpent won't be eating the dust anymore. No, the serpent will be crushed in Revelation 21. He looks beyond what Isaiah saw to see something even greater. The flood language for the original judgment is flood followed by heavens and earth. Flood of Noah, destruction of Babylon, new heavens and new earth, which again is what we see in 2 Peter 3:6. It's what we see in 2 Peter 3:6. Flood, cosmic destruction, new heavens and new earth. Go with me to 2 Peter 3. We're going to look at 2 Peter 3 three different times. After we look at Matthew 24, we're going to look at it again because there's Matthew 24 language in here. 2 Peter 3. For they deliberately overlook this fact, that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God. And that by means of these, the world that existed was deluged with water and perished. So what perished? The world perished. But it was the wicked of the world, right? But by the same word, the heavens and earth are being stored up for fire, being kept unto the day of judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. Okay? Which is what happened to Babylon. The destruction of the ungodly. But do not overlook this fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. The Lord will not be slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you all. And the reason he's waiting for this judgment is so that none of the elect would perish. Again, the picture is people being judged. Because when that day comes, the wicked people will be judged. And God doesn't want any of the elect to perish. And so because of that, he's being patient. He's waiting for that judgment. Again, this is not a judgment on the cosmos. This is a judgment on individuals. The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. So that's the Matthew 24 reference that we'll wait to talk about. The heavens will pass away and roar. The heavenly bodies will burn up and be dissolved. And the earth and the works that are done in it will be exposed. I think the ending there is clear. What's being judged are the works done on the earth, not the earth. Okay? What's being judged is not the earth. What's being judged is the works done on the earth. We'll get back to the phrase before it, but I want to keep going. What I want us to realize is all of this we can make sense of as individual judgments, except for basically one phrase. Judgment of individuals, except for basically one phrase. And that's a very complicated phrase. I'm going to keep going. So, what should we do? What should we do is we should live godly lives. We should live godly lives because the judgment of people is coming. And then in verse 13, we wait for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. I think this image comes directly from Isaiah. Comes directly from Isaiah. So then, here's the confusing part, right? The heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and destroyed, right? That's the confusing part. The rest of it, I think we've explained pretty well from the perspective of individuals are being judged. It all comes down to how you translate and what you think the heavenly bodies are. Because the only thing that's being destroyed here are the heavenly bodies. Now, the word that's used here for heavenly bodies, what does the New King James say? The elements? Yeah, the New King James says the elements.
Yeah, verse 10 it says.
So the question is, what are the elements? Now, what do you think of when you think of elements?
Earth, wind, fire.
Oh, do you? That's good. I think most people think of the periodic table, right? It's the elements, all those things you had to memorize back in high school or whatever. I don't think what he's saying is the elements, the molecules will burn up. I think there's two options. One is earth, wind, fire, water, which is a reference to paganism, I think. Or he could be referring to the elemental spirits of the world, which Peter uses in Colossians 2. He could be referring to spiritual beings that are being judged. Either way, I don't think he's referring to the physical cosmos. He is certainly referring to some kind of end times judgment that's cataclysmic. But I think it's cataclysmic in the same way that Babylon was judged. And the same language is used in Revelation, by the way, right? Stars falling from the sky, earthquakes, kings hiding under rocks. The same kind of language is used of Babylon in Isaiah 14. And I think if we read this through the lens of Isaiah 65 and we understand the new creation, which Peter uses here as the return from exile, the time in which righteousness dwells, the time in which Babylon isn't holding us captive any longer, the time we're no longer exiles. And I think this is just it's simply using the same kind of Old Testament language that describes the judgment of the wicked so that we can inherit a renewed creation. Does that mean this is an easy text? By no means. Do I still have questions about the text? Absolutely. They exist and are stored up for fire. But I don't think that necessarily means that the heavens and the earth are what burns. They're being stored up for the judgment. The earth is continuing to exist so that the judgment of the wicked can happen. I'm not saying this is an easy text, right? This is a difficult text. But in light of the new creation language in Isaiah 65, I think what this is saying is the heavens and earth, and he says that he's delaying the judgment so that the elect can be brought in, because God doesn't desire that any of them would perish. That's what he goes to next, right? So I think what he's saying is the heavens and the earth are continuing to exist so that the wicked can perish. However, that's from the perspective of the wicked. However, for the perspective of the righteous, God's not willing that any of them should perish, and the heavens and the earth are being preserved so that all of them can come to repentance. I think that's what it's saying. When John sees the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21, he uses neos for new, which consistently, it can be used as brand new or it can be used as renewed. But he could use language to describe it as a brand new, and he doesn't. He uses language that could be taken both ways. I take it as renewed, especially because, again, the more clear text interpret the unclear text. Right? The more clear text interpret. We could spend all day looking at these verses, and we would still have more questions about them. Romans 8 is the clear text. What we cannot do is make all our eschatology hang on unclear texts. And the new creation, return from exile language continues. So cosmos deconstruction and decreation language is described to use Judah's political downfall in Jeremiah 4, 23 through 28. So when Judah falls politically and they're destroyed, it's used like this. Can someone read this for us? Good, yeah, so Judah became without form and void, right, when it was destroyed. The same language is used in Ezekiel. So judgment against Jerusalem that came from Babylon, Ezekiel uses the same kind of language when he says this. And they will say, the land that was desolate, this is the return. So Ezekiel 24, 1 through 14 describes the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon, deconstruction, their decreation language. And then the rest of the world is also judged. The rest of the world is also judged when Jerusalem is judged. Why? What happened when Jerusalem was judged? Why would other nations be listed when Jerusalem was judged? You can look at the PowerPoint also. The PowerPoint will tell you, but I'm trying to make you think about it. Because they were also destroyed by Babylon. These nations that are described in Ezekiel, the whole world, it's the extent of the Babylonian Empire. It's the nations that were conquered by Babylon. The decreation, deconstruction language is used. But when Israel returns from exile, this is how it's described. They will say the land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolated ruined cities are now fortified and inhabited. And out of that, the new temple in Ezekiel comes, and this river that flows that renews the land. Okay, I'll make a quick observation on New Testament fulfillment, then we'll take a break and come back with questions on Isaiah. Then we're done with Isaiah. It's exciting. We got to go to Ezekiel. New Testament fulfillment language, there's a literal new creation. There's a literal new creation when we come out of exile. It's expanded to the whole creation and not just the promised land. We who are elect exiles find home in the renewed heaven and earth after the judgment of wicked Babylon. I think that's the picture. Jesus refers to the regeneration of heaven and earth in Matthew 19:28. The word for regeneration is used. Again, the picture, individual eschatology tells us about cosmic eschatology, right? Our salvation reveals a mystery. The earth will be changed. The regeneration of heaven and earth in Matthew 19:28. Luke also refers to the restoring of all things in Acts 3:21, the time of rest and refreshment coming, and the restoring of all things. Paul refers to Christ reconciling all things at the end time. Revelation 21:15, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever. We've already looked at Romans 8:19 through 22. The creation will be released from its bondage to decay. Peter refers to new heavens and new earth where righteousness dwells. The point of the destruction and new heavens and new earth in Peter, again, is coming out of exile into a land where righteousness dwells. And John refers to new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21:1. Sorry, I said it wrong. It's not neos. It's kainos. Kainos consistently means renewed and not different. It's new, meaning it's renewed. It's not distinct. It's renewed. This is a renewal of creation. So that big picture, biblical theology of heavens and earth, restoration of heavens and earth, our backdrop theology of common grace also, I think this big picture biblical theology helps us interpret 2 Peter 3, which we all say is a difficult text and can be read in more than one way. But I think 2 Peter 3 is drawing the Isaiah image of being elect exiles, Babylon or the wicked being destroyed through cosmic destruction language in the same time, just like it was in the day of Noah, and we inherit a world in which righteousness dwells when Christ returns.